The heater in the Corolla had been dead since October, so Nadia Whitmore drove with her coat zipped to her chin and her daughter's blanket tucked over both their laps at the red lights. Ivy was asleep in the back, or pretending to be. At 6 you learned that trick early, that if you kept your eyes shut long enough, the grown-ups forgot to worry in front of you. The light on Belrose Street stayed red a long time. Nadia watched a man in a doorway across the road count coins into his palm, then put them back in his pocket without buying whatever he'd been standing outside of. She understood the gesture better than she'd have liked. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. She already knew who it was. She let it ring twice, 3 times, then thumbed it silent and put it face down. "Was that Mr. Ape?" Ivy said from the back, not opening her eyes. "You're supposed to be sleeping." "I am sleeping. I can sleep in here." "That's a talent." "Was it him, though?" Nadia pulled forward when the light changed. It was the phone company. Boring. It hadn't been the phone company. It had been Daniel Ape, who owned the flat above the laundrette where they'd lived for 2 years and 4 months, and who had knocked on their door that morning with an envelope he didn't want to hand over, holding it the way you'd hold something that might bite. 14 days, the letter inside said. He'd looked at his own shoes while she read it. "I hate this," he'd said. "You know I hate this." And she did know. That was almost the worst part. She'd been a surveyor once. That was the word she never said out loud anymore because of the way people's faces did a small collapse when they heard it, the O. So what happened they were too polite to ask. Building surveys, structural condition reports, the unglamorous back-office work of deciding whether a wall was going to hold or a roof was lying about its age. She'd been good. She'd been better than good, though she'd stopped believing that at some point in the last 3 years and hadn't noticed it go. What happened was Marcus, and then the thing after Marcus, which she was even less inclined to explain. What happened was that she'd walked out of a firm called Halloway and Prentice on a Tuesday, and hadn't walked into another one since, because references were required, and hers would have come from a man who'd made very sure she'd never ask him for one. Now she cleaned offices on the night rotation for a contractor called Brightwork, and on Saturdays she did shifts at a garden center when they'd have her, and it added up to almost enough, which was a different and crueler thing than enough. The garden center was where she met him, though she wouldn't understand that until later either. His name was Arthur Feltham, and he came in every Saturday for a single bag of bonemeal he never seemed to use up, and he had the particular slowness of a man who decided time was the one thing he still owned outright. 80s, she guessed. A good coat gone shabby at the cuffs. He always paid in exact change, counted out on the counter with a fingertip, and he always said thank you as though she'd done something that mattered. That Saturday he watched her ring up his bonemeal and said, "You've got a survey eye." She looked up, "Sorry." "You looked at the crack over the door when you came in. Most people don't look up. You looked up and you looked at it. Settlement or the lintel." She laughed before she could stop herself, the first real one in a while. "Lintel's fine, it's the render. Somebody patched over damp instead of fixing it, and it's coming back through." Arthur nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected for years. "Thought so," he said, and took his bonemeal and left. She didn't think about him again until the following Thursday, when he died. She only knew because the garden center manager, a soft-spoken man named Colin, mentioned it the way people mention weather. That old boy who buys the bonemeal. Feltham. Went in his sleep, apparently. Neighbor found him Tuesday. Colin said it and then asked her to restock the seed potatoes, and Nadia stood holding a tray of Mari's pipers and felt something she had no right to feel, because you couldn't grieve a man you'd spoken to 11 times. But she did feel it. A small closing of a door she hadn't known was open. She restocked the potatoes. She went home. She read Ivy the book about the fox for the 9th night running because Ivy would accept no substitutes, and she lay awake after with the eviction letters 14 days counting themselves down behind her eyes, now 9, and she did not think about Arthur Feltham again. Until the letter came. It arrived on a Monday, in an envelope so thick and creamy it looked like a wedding invitation, from a firm called Orley & Sons, solicitors, of an address in a town 40 minutes north that Nadia had driven through once and remembered only for its bridge. She turned it over twice. She was so certain it was a mistake, a debt sold on, a court thing, some new bad news dressed up in good paper, that she nearly didn't open it until evening. Dear Ms. Whitmore, it began. We are instructed in the estate of the late Mr. Arthur James Feltham, who named you as a beneficiary in his will dated the 3rd of March. She read it 4 times. The words rearranged themselves obligingly each time and still said the same impossible thing. Arthur Feltham had left her something. A man she'd sold bonemeal to. A man whose Christian name she'd learned from his debit card. The something was a house. There's a catch, she told Priya on the phone that night, because there was always a catch, and because Priya was the only person left who'd known her before and hadn't flinched away after. Read me the exact words. Nadia read them. The property known as Gorsehill, Cold Harbor Lane, in its current condition and contents, together with the residue of my estate after expenses, which the beneficiary will find to be negligible. Negligible, Priya repeated, meaning no money. Meaning no money, and I looked the place up. It's Priya, it's a wreck. The listing photos are from a survey 10 years ago and it looked half dead then. Roof's gone at the back. There's a tree growing out of the chimney. So sell it, even a wreck is land. It's got a restriction on the title, I can't sell for 2 years. He wrote that in specially. Nadia laughed thin. He left me a house I can't sell, that costs money to keep, that I can't afford to fix, and I have. She checked the calendar magnet on the fridge. 6 days until I'm evicted from the flat I actually live in. Priya was quiet a moment. Or, she said, you've got somewhere to live in 6 days. Nadia hadn't thought of it that way. She looked at the listing photo again, the sagging gutters, the boarded window, the tree. Somewhere to live. I'd need to see it, she said slowly. Gorsehill sat at the end of a lane that stopped being tarmac a quarter mile before the house and became mud pretending to be gravel. Nadia left the Kerala where the mud got serious and walked the rest, Ivy's hand in hers, both of them looking up at the thing they now apparently owned. It was worse than the photos and somehow better. Worse because the survey pictures had been kind. The render was blown across the whole south face. The porch had detached itself by a clear inch, and the tree in the chimney had friends now. A whole small society of Budleia colonizing the parapet. Better because it was big and it was theirs, and it had the particular dignity of a building that had been well made once and was only being punished for being alone. Ivy said, it's a castle. It's not a castle, love. It's a broken castle. That Nadia thought was fair. She let them in with the fat iron key from Orley & Sons, and the door swung on hinges that someone had oiled recently, that snagged her attention before anything else did. A dead man's door shouldn't move that sweetly. Someone had been here since March, maybe the neighbor, maybe the solicitor's clerk. She filed it away. Inside was cold and smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and underneath, the mineral damp she knew in her bones. Her survey eye woke up whether she wanted it to or not. She read the hallway the way other people read a face. The crack over the stairs old, stable, plastered and moved again, nothing. The stain blooming on the ceiling active this winter, the valley gutter above it choked. The floor that dipped toward the back of the house where the joists had given up. And the papers, that was the thing she couldn't read at all. Every room had them. Not hoarding, she'd cleaned for hoarders, and this wasn't that. This was filing. Box files and lever arch folders and flat archival boxes, labeled in a small, precise hand. Stacked on shelves Arthur had clearly built himself, and stacked again on the floor where the shelves ran out. The front room was nothing but boxes. The dining room was boxes and a single chair positioned to face them, as if he'd sat and kept them company in the evenings. She opened one at random. Deeds. Not his. She could see that at a glance. The property described was a terrace of cottages, 11 of them on a street called Weaver's Row that she'd never heard of. Conveyances, tenancy agreements, a rent book with entries in fountain pen going back to the 1950s. Another box, correspondence, decades of it, held with treasury tags. Another, photographs of houses, ordinary houses, each one captioned on the back with an address and a date and sometimes a single word she didn't understand. Demolished, cleared, compulsory. "Mum," Ivy called from the next room, "there's a whole box of just one house." There was. A flat gray archival box, and inside it nothing but material about a single building, a chapel, by the look of it, or a hall, photographs and plans and letters, and a bundle of what she thought might be shares. On the lid, in Arthur's hand, "SDJUDES, the one that matters." Nadia sat down in the dead man's chair, and did not get up for a long time. They moved in on the last day, because there was no other day left. It took 2 trips in the Corolla and 1 borrowed van from Priya's brother-in-law, who didn't ask questions and didn't stay for tea, which Nadia appreciated more than tea. Everything they owned fit with room to spare in a house built for a family of 10 and a staff of 4. Ivy claimed a bedroom on the strength of a window seat, and Nadia took the one next to it, and they slept the first night in a house with a tree in the chimney and boxes in every room, and Nadia was fairly sure, mice in the walls having a difficult conversation about the new arrivals. She lay awake again. Different ceiling, same arithmetic. But underneath the arithmetic, for the first time in a long time, a second track was running, and the second track was St. Jude's, the one that matters, and it would not turn off. In the morning she made Ivy porridge on a camp stove and started to read. It took her a week to understand what Arthur had been. He'd been a clerk. That was the plain fact of it, a rent clerk, then an estates clerk for a company called Marley Holdings that had owned, at its height, most of the working streets of the town to the north and a good deal besides. He'd started at 16 in 1961 and he'd retired in 2004, and in between he had kept the records. All of them. And at some point, she couldn't yet pin when he'd started keeping a second set. The company's records were tidy and official and told one story. Arthur's private set told another, and the difference between them was the whole of it. Weaver's Row, the 11 cottages. The official file said the tenants had left voluntarily, been rehoused. The properties sold on for redevelopment in 1988, all above board. Arthur's file had the rent book showing families who'd lived there 40 years, and letters those families had written, pleading, then angry, then defeated, and a single sheet in Arthur's own hand listing where each family had actually ended up, which was mostly nowhere good, and at the bottom, underlined once, they were told they had no rights. They had rights. I filed them. He'd filed them. Somewhere in these boxes were the documents proving that people who'd been moved out with nothing had, in fact, been entitled to a great deal. Arthur had known it at the time. He'd been made to process it. And he'd kept every scrap for 40 years, waiting, she understood now, for someone with a survey eye who'd look up instead of away. St. Jude's was the heart of it. She saved that box for last, the way you save the thing you're afraid of. When she finally opened it properly, at the kitchen table with Ivy asleep upstairs and a single lamp run off the one working socket, she laid the contents out in order and made herself read slowly, the way she'd been trained to read a structural report, for what was there, and then harder for what wasn't. St. Jude's had been a mission hall and almshouse on the edge of town, endowed in 1889 by a wool merchant named Cabot for the benefit of the aged and infirm poor of this parish in perpetuity. In perpetuity. Arthur had underlined that too. There were the founding deeds and the trust that ran it, and a list of the almswomen, always women, 12 of them, with a right to live there for life. In 1991, Marley Holdings had acquired the site. The official file said the trust had been wound up as no longer viable, and the land redeveloped. Arthur's file said something else. It said the trust could not lawfully have been wound up because the endowment was perpetual and the beneficiaries still existed. There had been 9 women living there when it happened, women in their 70s and 80s who'd been told the charity had run out of money and they'd have to go. It said Marley had known this, and it said, on a sheet clipped to the top with a rusted paperclip in Arthur's hand, "The trust was never dissolved. It cannot be. The land is still held on the 1889 terms. Whoever holds Gorsehill holds the papers, and whoever holds the papers can prove it. AJF. Whoever holds Gorsehill." Nadia set the sheet down very carefully, as though it might go off. Arthur hadn't left her a house. He'd left her a case, and he'd made sure she couldn't sell it for 2 years because he needed her to keep it long enough to read it. She sat with that a while. Then she thought about the door that had swung too sweetly on oiled hinges, and about who else might know these boxes were here, and what they'd be worth to make disappear. And her survey eye, which had spent a decade telling her which walls would hold, told her quietly that she just moved her daughter into the one building somebody, somewhere, most needed to burn down. The company still existed, after a fashion. Marley Holdings had shed its skin twice since 1991, and now went by Cabot Regeneration, which made Nadia laugh out loud when she found it, alone, at 11 at night, because they'd taken the name of the man whose charity they'd dismantled and hung it over the door like a trophy. The wool merchant's name used to sell luxury flats on the land he'd left to the poor in perpetuity. The face of it was a man called Julian Pruitt, grandson of the Marley chairman who'd signed off the wind-up in '91, though the website didn't mention that. The website mentioned heritage and stewardship and the phrase building on the past. There was a photograph of him at a ribbon cutting, sleeves rolled to look like a man who worked, and a quote about honoring the fabric of the community. St. Jude's site was his flagship, 41 flats, a coffee place, a wellness studio. Phase 2 breaking ground in the spring. Phase 2, Nadia understood after an hour with the site plans Arthur had helpfully kept, would sit directly on the ground still legally held by a charitable trust that had never been dissolved. If the trust was live, Cabot Regeneration didn't own what it was about to build on. If the trust was live, the whole thing came apart. Which meant the papers in her front room weren't just a record of an old wrong. They were a live threat to a man midway through the most profitable development of his career. She turned off the lamp and sat in the dark and listened to the house, and the house, for once, said nothing back. Her first ally arrived by accident, which was the only way Nadia let anyone in anymore. She'd taken a box of the weaver's raw material to the county archive in town, partly to photocopy it somewhere with electricity, and partly because she needed a second set of eyes that wasn't Priya's kind sympathy. The archivist on duty was a woman about her own age, cardigan, reading glasses on a chain, a name badge reading MOKO and KWO. She glanced at what Nadia was copying, then glanced again, then said, "Where did you get these?" Not accusatory, hungry. "I inherited them," Nadia said, "sort of long story." "Is one of them a Marley rent book?" Green foolscap, entries in fountain pen. Nadia went still. "How do you know that?" The archivist Margaret, it turned out, though everyone called her Meg, took off her glasses. "Because I've been looking for it for 11 years, she said. "My grandmother lived on Weaver's Row. They told her she had no rights. She died believing it." She looked at the box and then at Nadia, and something passed between them that didn't need words. "I think you'd better tell me the long story." The watcher came a few days after that. Nadia noticed the car because noticing was her whole training. A gray estate parked at the top of the mud lane 2 mornings running, engine off. A man inside who was very interested in his phone whenever she looked and not interested in it at all when she didn't. On the 3rd morning it was gone, and when she got back from the school run the oiled front door was shut exactly as she'd left it, which was the problem, because she'd left it not quite shut, the way she always did, propped a half-inch on the swollen frame. Someone had closed it properly. Someone tidy. Someone who'd been inside and wanted her not to know, and had been just careful enough to give themselves away to the one kind of person who reads buildings for a living. Nothing was taken. She checked the St. Jude's box first, heart going, and it was there, every sheet. But the box beside it, Weaver's Row, had been gone through. She could tell because Arthur had filed it front to back by date and someone had put 3 folders back the wrong way round. They hadn't found what they were looking for, which meant they'd be back. And it meant that somewhere, someone had already understood exactly what she'd inherited and had decided the boxes were worth the risk of a man in a gray car and a quiet second key. She stood in the cold front room a long moment. Then she did the thing Arthur would have wanted, the thing a clerk's daughter of the mind would do. She started to copy everything. 2 copies. One to Meg at the archive, one somewhere Pruitt would never think to look. If they wanted to make the papers disappear, she'd make the papers impossible to disappear. That night she moved the St. Jude's box under Ivy's window seat, behind the panel that Arthur, she was sure of it now, had cut and refitted for exactly this. It slid in like it had been made to, because it had. The offer came on the good paper too. Not from Pruitt himself. Men like Pruitt didn't sign the first letters. It came from a firm called Denhurst Property Partners, acting for a client interested in the Cold Harbor Lane site. And it was warm and reasonable, and offered Nadia a sum of money that made her sit down. £240,000 for a wreck she couldn't legally sell for another 21 months. The letter was very relaxed about the 21 months. The letter said the client was content to wait and would hold the offer open and could arrange an advance against completion if her circumstances were pressing. If her circumstances were pressing, they knew about the eviction then. They'd looked. Nadia read it twice and understood it perfectly. It was not an offer for a house. Nobody offered £250,000 for a house with a tree in the chimney. It was an offer for the boxes, made by people who couldn't say so, and the advance against completion line was the real message. We know you're broke, we know you have a child, take the money and go away. The old Nadia, the one from before Marcus, before the long slide, would have taken it. Not because she was weak, but because she was tired, and £240,000 was a warm flat in Ivy's own bedroom, and never again standing at a garden center till counting somebody else's exact change. She let herself want it for a full evening. She was honest with herself about that. She'd earned the wanting. Then she took the letter to Meg. "They've made a mistake," Meg said, reading it at the archive counter, glasses down her nose. "Offering too much." "Offering at all." Meg set it down. "If the trust were dead, if your papers were worthless, they'd let the 2 years run and buy it off you for 40 grand as a knockdown plot. They wouldn't be this frightened." She tapped the sum. "This is the price of not going to court. This is what they think it costs to make sure a court never sees what's in your front room." She looked up. "Which tells us the thing we couldn't be sure of on our own. The papers work. Pruitt's lawyers have looked at the risk and priced it. And the price is £250,000 just to make you go quiet." Nadia had known it in her survey bones. But hearing it said made it real, the way a crack becomes a defect the moment you write it in the report. "So I say no," she said. "You say no," Meg agreed, "and then it stops being letters." It stopped being letters. The first thing was small and deniable, which was how these things always started. She knew that from the Weaver's Row files, where the pressure on those families had begun with clerical errors and lost paperwork before it ever became eviction. Brightwork, the cleaning contractor, called to say her night shifts were being restructured, and there wasn't a slot for her anymore. No reason given. A week later, the garden center's Saturday work dried up the same way, Colin apologetic and vague, and unable to meet her eye down the phone. She had no proof it was Pruitt. That was the point of doing it that way. You couldn't fight a shrug. But she recognized the shape of it. Somebody was cutting off her air. Somebody had worked out that a woman with a child and no income doesn't fight a developer for 21 months. She takes the advance against completion and she's grateful. It was, in its way, a compliment. They'd stopped treating her like a problem that would go away and started treating her like one that wouldn't. She sat Ivy down that night, at the kitchen table, in the cold house with the one working socket, and she thought about the almswomen of St. Jude's who'd been told they had no rights, and about Meg's grandmother who'd died believing it, and about a rent clerk who'd filed the truth for 40 years and left it to a stranger who looked up. "Are we going to be okay?" Ivy asked, 6 going on old. "We're going to be poor for a while," Nadia said, because she'd promised herself she wouldn't lie to her the way the world lied to people like them. "And then I think we're going to be all right. I've got something worth more than money. I've just got to be brave enough to keep it." Ivy considered this with the gravity of the very young. "Is it the boxes?" "It's the boxes." "Okay," said Ivy, and went back to her porridge, satisfied, because at 6 the world is still a place where the grown-up says brave and means it. The lawyer took some finding. Meg knew the local firms and ruled most of them out in an afternoon, too small, or too cozy with Cabot Regeneration, which sponsored the cricket club and the summer fair, and had a way of being everyone's friend in a town that size. What they needed was someone who couldn't be squeezed and didn't mind being disliked. Meg found her in the end at a legal advice clinic 2 towns over. A woman named Frances Bellow, who ran charity and trust litigation for a chambers in the city, and did 1 clinic a month out of what she called stubbornness, mostly. Nadia went with a box on the passenger seat and a knot in her stomach, expecting to be told, gently, that it was hopeless. Everyone eventually told her things were hopeless. It was practically a formality. Frances read for 40 minutes without speaking. She was a small, precise woman who turned each page as though it owed her money, and when she finally looked up her expression was not sympathy, which Nadia was braced for, but something closer to appetite. "Do you understand what you have here?" Frances said. It wasn't quite a question. "I think so, I hope so." A charitable trust cannot be dissolved by the people who find it inconvenient. It can't be dissolved at all, really, not one endowed in perpetuity. It can only be varied by the Charity Commission or the court, and only then to carry out the founder's intention as near as possible, never to hand the land to a developer for flats. Frances set her hand flat on the St. Jude's box, almost protective. "Marley didn't wind this up. They can't have. They wrote a letter saying they had, and everyone was too old or too frightened to argue. But the trust is still there. It's been sitting there since 1991, holding land that a company has spent 30 years building on and selling as though it owned it." She looked at Nadia. "Do you know what that means?" "That they're in trouble. It means every flat on that site was sold on a title that isn't clean. It means Cabot Regeneration has a hole under its balance sheet the size of the whole development. It means," and here Frances almost smiled, "that your Mr. Feltham didn't leave you a case. He left you a bomb, and he spent 40 years assembling the detonator, and he left that to you too." Then Frances stopped smiling, because she was good, and being good meant seeing the other side of it. "You need to understand the shape of what you're taking on," she said. "This isn't a wrong that gets put right in a month and everyone claps. Pruitt has money, lawyers, and the whole town half in his pocket. The first thing he'll do, the thing he's already doing from what you've told me, is make your life untenable, quietly, so you fold before it ever reaches a courtroom. Most people fold. There's no shame in it. I've watched better resource people than you fold. If you do this, it will be the hardest thing you've done, and it will take longer than you can afford, and there will be a night, probably several, where the sensible thing, the loving thing for your daughter, will look like taking his money and walking away." She held Nadia's eye. "I need to know you know that before I put a single hour into this, because I don't start what I don't finish, and I don't want you starting what you can't." Nadia thought about it. She made herself think about it properly, not the brave version, Ivy in the cold house, the shifts drying up, the £240,000 sitting warm in a letter in a drawer. "There were 9 of them," she said finally. 9 women living in St. Jude's when they wound it up. Are any of them still alive? Frances looked at her a moment. One, she said, as far as I've been able to find. A Mrs. Iris Coote. She's 91. She's in a care home the council pays for on the edge of the same town, half a mile from the flats they built where her home used to be. The room was very quiet. Then I'm not folding, Nadia said. Tell me what you need. Iris Coote remembered everything. That was the gift and the danger of her, Frances warned on the drive over. A witness with a memory that sharp was worth more than any document, and also a woman of 91 whom Prewitt's people would very much prefer stayed forgotten. They found her in a day room that smelled of talc and gravy, small in a large chair, hands folded, watching a garden through glass. She looked at Nadia with the frank assessment of the very old, who have stopped bothering to pretend. You've got papers, Iris said before anyone had said anything. You've got the clerk's papers, Arthur's. Nadia sat down slowly. You knew Arthur. He came to see me, years ago now, told me he'd kept it all, that one day someone would come, that I wasn't to give up. Her hands moved in her lap. I gave up anyway, you do at my age, but here you are. She looked at Nadia for a long moment and her eyes were wet and perfectly clear. They told us the money had run out, that the charity was finished and we'd been a burden long enough. I was 61. I'd lived there 9 years. My friend Dorothy died the winter after they moved us different homes. We never, she stopped. Started again, steadier. They said we had no rights. We were old women. Who were we going to tell? You had every right, Nadia said. It's all there. Arthur filed it. The trust was never dissolved. It couldn't be. That land is still yours and the other women's and whoever comes after. Iris was silent a while. Outside, a wren worked along the top of the fence. Say that again, she said. The part where it was never dissolved. Nadia said it again. The old woman closed her eyes. 40 years I've been ashamed, she said, for being a burden, and I was never a burden at all. They just wanted the land. She opened her eyes and there was something in them now that hadn't been there when they came in, not hope exactly, older and harder than hope. You put me in that courtroom, girl, whatever it costs. I'll not die ashamed of a thing I never did.